This video is for those who are hand sewing the Zero Waste Photinia top and dress views 1 and 3. This video covers how to hand sew the armhole facing to the bodice and also construction for the armhole facing in general, which is super quick. I'm going to get into that right now. So this is my finished armhole facing. I'll show you how I got this result. Starting off, you should have a facing piece that is 7 inches wide. So 7 inches wide, depending on how you're holding it, 7 inches wide, and then the length is the circumference of your armhole. So this is what you should have. Right sides together, you are going to fold it in half lengthwise, finger press, and then stitch the short ends together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you can do that either using a running stitch or a back stitch. It's up to you. Just needs to be a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I have my finished one here, and just to show you, I used a running stitch for this. They weren't very close together just because it's going to be top stitched over anyway. So I just wasn't really, my goal was to hold the fabric together. And that's what you want. You don't want to be lazy with it. You want to make sure that they're an even spacing and that they're pretty sturdy in holding the fabric together decently. But it doesn't have to be, completely sturdy. If you do want a sturdier stitch here, then you can of course use a back stitch. So I'm turning this inside out so that now it is right side out with wrong sides together. I gave this a nice good finger press as well. You can use an iron, but we are hand sewing, so we're using our fingers and our hands to press this nice and flat. And then if you want, you can baste or use a running stitch and baste this bottom opening closed so that it just is stabilized for you. It's not necessary, but you can do that if you prefer. So now it's time to sew the facing onto my garment. And this garment was not hand sewn, just FYI if you're seeing certain stitches. I didn't hand sew this complete garment. But yeah, so so now we're going to attach the armhole facing to our bodice or dress. So I have my shoulder seam here. This is my shoulder seam for my bodice or dress. And I'm going to match the center of the armhole to that shoulder seam. So I'm going to do that by finding the middle, placing it there, and then laying it flat. And then that should leave me pretty centered. So after I've done that, I'm going to pin the armhole facing in place. And then I'm going to stitch the armhole facing to the bodice at the armhole opening using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you're going to stitch this, use a back stitch preferably because you're then going to understitch. So you're going to stitch this down and then we're going to understitch and then come back here and I'll show you what to do next. So I've attached my facing to my bodice, and so now I've pressed it outward. So I'm pressing it towards the seam allowance, and I use my nail, but you can also just use the tip of your finger. I'm going to finger press it down nice and flat. Making sure everything is flat here. Now I'm going to understitch. Now the understitching is just so the seam allowance stays into place. Because of that, I just running stitch my understitching. I don't use a back stitch, but you of course are welcome to use a back stitch to understitch your facing if you would like, or to understitch, period. If you want to use a running stitch to do that, you can. What I do to do that is I just go along the seam, 1/8 inch away from the seam. And this probably is not the best needle for me to use for this because it's huge, but you just go 1/8 inch away from the seam, and then you can just do a running stitch along the seam. So let me change needles. Okay, much better, much better. All right, so we're going to understitch our seam, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm just going to use a running stitch to do so, and all you have to do is go under and over. Getting started, because the fabric is a little thick, you may have to push and use your thimble to get it through, or use some needle pullers. But that's the beginning of your understitching. You of course can anchor your thread when you start, but because this is going to be top stitch in place, I'll be able to secure my threads later on. So we're just going to understitch along this line of stitching. And you're going to continue down the length of the armhole facing, and then we'll go to the next step. So now that we've understitched our facing to our garment, we're going to turn it to the wrong side. And you will notice that this garment is not completely hand sewn. It's just the nature of the business. Sometimes I have to interchange between the two. So moving this over, we're going to lay it towards the seam allowance flat. Just like that. And then we're going to pin it in place. So we're going to start on one end over here, and then we're going to go to the other end. We want to stabilize the ends first, that way it doesn't shift or move. And then after that, we're going to stabilize the middle so it doesn't shift. The point of this is just so it doesn't shift. You don't want the facing to be moving while you're sewing it. Okay, so now that that's sewn, what you'll do is you'll backstitch from the outside. Well, you have two options. You can backstitch from the outside, feeling along the seam line to know where you're stitching. You can also use a marking tool and mark on the outside so you know where to stitch as an outline. Alternatively, you can use a running stitch. A running stitch shows up the same on the front and the back, whereas a back stitch shows up differently. If you use a back stitch from this side, it'll show the wrong or bobbin side of the thread on the right side of your fabric. So you usually don't want to do it like that, but you can if that's your preference. But I like to either back stitch from the outside or just use a basic running stitch and top stitch along the armhole facing. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to backstitch from the outside to hold this, to put this into place. And this is one of my favorite things to do just because it's a little challenging, but I like a challenge. So we're going to see how this goes. I'll show you how to do this. So again, I am feeling along this area to know as a guideline where my stitching is. And so what I'm going to do, you also can use a top stitching thread like a sashiko thread or embroidery thread and put it in your needle. That way it shows a decorative stitch on the outside. But I'm going to show you how to backstitch from the outside starting now. So to backstitch from the outside, I'm going to knot my thread. And I'm going to come in underneath here. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. There we go. And come out on the other side. Okay, so we've pinned in place so we don't have to worry about anything shifting for now. Basically, we're just going to feel underneath as we stitch to make sure that we're on the edge. And then you're going to check I would say every 3 to 5 stitches to make sure that your stitching is on the edge as you're top stitching. So I'm going to start with my first stitch, which is going to be super big because of that spacing. So that's my first stitch. And now I have my second stitch. And I'm still pretty good on where my stitches are located. This is a very slow and meditative process when it comes to backstitching from the outside. You don't want to rush this because these stitches will be visible. So take your time when you do this and just go slow. There's absolutely no rush. And then, you know, do stitch by stitch, trying to make them as evenly as possible. If anybody's staring that hard at your stitch work, then they really need to get a life. Okay, so let's look on this side. If you notice from this side, you can see my bobbin stitches. And then you can see they're basically on the edge. So I did a pretty good job in keeping them on the edge. Now it's just consistently keeping it that way while also trying to make my stitches straight and even. It's a tricky process, but once you get the hang of it and you learn to kind of go slow and take your time, and you become pretty familiar with the width that you like of your stitches, then everything kind of works out for the better in that endeavor. So I'm gonna come here. I'm gonna go all the way till I get to the corner, and then I'm gonna show you how I handle the corner. Again, this is a slow process. There's no need to rush this part at all because the stitches will be visible, but there's also no need to focus on being completely perfect because no one should be looking at our stitches that seriously. Your stitches are precious. If anybody's looking at them and judging them, then it's pretty invasive. Okay, I kind of feel that I'm getting to the corner. And so now that I'm getting to the corner here, let's see, there is the corner. Where I'm coming out is the corner. And so I'm going to make this one stitch. And then as you can see, I've hit the corner. I'm going to go under. Then go back up and come back out. And then I'm going to continue my stitching like this. Just continuously feeling underneath to know where I'm going. And that's basically it. That's how you can stitch from the outside. And once you've done that, then it's pretty easy to just consistently keep your stitching going. I find that once you get into a rhythm, it's pretty simple to make your stitches pretty even once you get the hang of it. You can always practice making some back stitches on a scrap piece of fabric just to make sure you're getting everything right. This is not supposed to be quick if you do this option. If you want a quick option, I suggest definitely doing a running stitch. It'll be a lot easier for you to kind of get the hang of a, you know, just playing with top stitching and stitching from the outside or the inside. You can running stitch from the outside to kind of play and get an idea of what you're supposed to do. But the back stitching from the outside is not supposed to be quick, so just keep that in mind as you're stitching. And then, you know, we can just continue down and then do the other side of the armhole, and then continue on and follow the instructions to move forward.